I read Daniel 7:19. Begins, then I will know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, and his nails of brass, which devour, break in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. Rome was the mightiest empire known to that time, symbolically. Symbolically, it had the strength of iron. Recall that in Daniel chapter 2, these four empires were represented as a large statue of 4 meters: gold, silver, copper, and iron. The last of these, the one called iron, represented the Roman Empire with strength like iron. In this text, though Rome was described chiefly as iron, it is as having nails of brass. Leviticus chapter 26, long before, warned Israel that if they were not obedient to God, they would be subdued by other nations. In Leviticus chapter 26, verse 19, both iron and brass are used there to represent the burden that other nations would place on Israel. I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heaven as iron and your earth as brass. Both of these strong metals are used in this warning, and both of these metals are praised in the political powers. He suggests, Parkinson, the Hiruli, Ostrogoths, Lombards, Alemanni, Anglo-Saxons, Franks, Burgundians, Visigoths, Sylvie, and Vandals. The term other horn in verse 20 refers to the little horn of Daniel 7:8, which represents the Roman Catholic Church. This horn is described in Daniel 7, verse 8 as having eyes like the eyes of man and a mouth speaking great things. The eyes in this horn represent the appearance of wisdom claimed by papacy for centuries. The mouth speaking great things shows that papacy spoke arrogantly with many great and as though they represented the dictate of God himself. This horn is described as more stout than his fellows in Daniel chapter 7 verse 20. The expression more stout than his fellows represents that papacy was a strong and enduring institution, even more strong and more enduring than many of the 10 nations represented by the 10 horns. Daniel 7:21 then says, I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. Papacy, the Roman Catholic Church, persecuted the saints greatly during the Dark Ages. In Revelation chapter 17, 3-6, papacy is represented by an immoral woman with the name Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, on her forehead. Then in verse 6 of Revelation 18, this woman is described as drunken with the blood of saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. This describes the fact that papacy, in their earnest endeavor to retain their own power over other Christians, often force their rule upon others with the sword. In volume 2, and that is a volume, when I read volume 2, it fell from my hand, and I cried, what papacy, what Rome did to Christians. That is in volume 2, The Time is at Hand, chapter 9, that is the man of sin. Brother Russell gives the testimony of history about the remarkable persecution, even to death, imposed by papacy on other Christians. He several instances in which whole towns and cities were invaded by soldiers and put to the sword. Both men and women, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people, of God's people, through the ages, perished in this persecution. Volume 2, page 346. What have I learned from the 3 verses? Power. To be number one, to be the head. I learned from the 3 chapters to be humble. We don't need power, we don't need sword for God to bless us, to be lifted high. Instead, it needs humility. We need, and when we are humble, God will lift us. But Rome, papacy, used the sword. I asked myself, in our midst, do we impose, do we use negative means to be the head, to be seen, to be recognized? Are we humble? And if we are humble, we'll be lifted. And I want to say, I believe that we should compete in the church. And the competition is to see the person who is humble. I want to be the first to be the humblest person in the scene. And I know if I'm humble, God will lift me. God, humility, as it is said, is the ground on which other virtues can grow. But Rome was proud. If you saw, or if, as we read in the volume 2, I'm telling the truth, when I read, I cried. The Inquisition, I cried. I saw Christians killing Christians. Does this happen among us? It can also happen in another way. When we talk evil against our brothers or against our sisters, it's the same thing. I don't think it's another way. So that it should be seen, so that it should be known. My desire, my advice is that we should be humble and God will bless and will give us. May God bless us.
Thank you, Brother Alex. Now is the time to ask Brother Alex questions on his presentation. Who has a question? Who has a question? Who has a question? So you can identify yourself by a show of a hand. Sister Carol.
Thank you very much. You said we should be in competition with the brethren and we should be first to do something, but I didn't hear what you said. You could repeat.
I was saying that we not, we Bible students, we don't compete, we will complement. But if we, our competition should be to be humble. I can compete with my brother to be more humble. I can compete with my brother. The competition is to be more humble than you. To always let him take the first place and take the second place. That's my competition. That's simple.
I'm seeing Brother
Alex, for the prophetic sharing of Daniel. In verses 21, where we have just read, I believe this was a message given to Daniel by an angel or in a vision by God, and to be our message when we read and understand. I wonder what is the reason behind this verse 21? It says, behold, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. And we have known well that the horn that is purposeful, why is the merciful God, loving and kind, would allow this horn triumph against the saints?
Earlier said that God has warned Israel that if they will be disobedient, if they will not keep to his command, so God permitted it to happen to correct Israel. God only permits it for a time to correct Israel.
The horn that's being talked about here is the main war with the saints. It makes sense to me that this is talking about maybe the third period of the church, where we start to see the battle between the Trinitarians and the non-Trinitarians. This is a little horn in its first growing stage. And again, when we talk about 1260 years, which we were just talking about at dinner, the papal church had total control over the true church. And so they were trampled underfoot, so to speak. And so I think that's what the horn that made war with the saints and prevailed against them. I think that's what it's talking about.
How do we deal with the issue of this beast beginning after the Greek beast? There is no Christian church, but it seems to be focused, and I think this was brought up in one of the very early talks, on the way in which these universal empires would affect of God and Israel. And now we see, and I clearly agree with you, there's a shift to focusing on what's happening with the people of God in the church. But the focus is now away from Israel, and it's now away from the Jews. So how do we deal with that? And if you can answer that, that'll save me 5 minutes tomorrow. Since we know we're starting with a transition from the Greek Universal Empire to the Roman Universal Empire, at that period it is affecting it's affecting Israel, and we have a shift now away from Israel onto the Christian church, and I believe that's correct. I believe that's correct. But how do we use these verses to okay, I'll say it one more time. When we go through the beasts, and the first three are identified by name, so there's no issue. This is affecting the people of Israel, the Jews. there is no Christian church because Christ hasn't come. But the Roman Empire is there, and they take Israel. Now we have a transition into a focus on the activity of this beast as it continued, and it's affecting the Christian church. And we're focusing in ways on what was happening in one part of the church in Europe. But how do we work with these transitions in these verses? Because, if we're critically thinking, we've made a transition. We've all been comfortable with that. But how do we do that in these verses?
Where's the dead? The church, even when the Roman, they took power, the church has been existing only in hiding. Because when we talk of the, you remember when the Catholics started holding ecumenical council, it was to fight against, even fighting against the church. Because we know the first ecumenical council was to fight against Arios, the second and all those people to fight against them. We remember that during the first ecumenical council, we saw that the bishops, when they gathered, I think the purpose was to fight against the doctrine of Arios. We learned that Bishop Nicolas crossed the hall and spun Arios, showing that we're not seeing by that time.
Came to the nation of Israel, and the Jews rejected him. They were given a specific Daniel about the 70 weeks prophecy. They were given a specific period of time that they would have exclusive opportunities to become the bride of Christ. They rejected him. And he was cut off in the midst. And after the 70 weeks ended, the opportunity was extended to you, to me, to Gentiles. So from that point of time, as a matter of fact, what happened was that the Jews, per se, they persecuted even the Christians originally. Like Paul, until he had his Damascus Road experience. And then he was turned around and he received the Holy Spirit. And his eyes were enlightened. What happened was that, the Jewish nation per se, when Titus's army came in and spread it and laid waste, they were scattered all over. So that's the transition. Because now we're dealing with the Spirit begotten, and although initially in the early part of the first century, most of the Spirit begotten were former Jews, that's why the missionary work went out, and Paul, who was the apostle to the Gentiles primarily, he did extensive missionary work. That's how the Spirit begotten Christians come in. So, yeah. And so prophecy, when you talk about prophecies, we have to understand that period of time when favor would return to national Israel much, much later, and we're looking at that now. That's the transition.